Hey folks, in today's video I will be talking about pelvic floor. I'm particularly talking to all of you ladies who had children and all of you like 55, 60 plus, because proper functioning of the pelvic floor will be of significant importance when it comes to maintaining good quality of life. And I'm not just talking about pain and discomfort, I'm also talking about simply urinary and fecal continence. When we talk about the pelvic floor, we need to understand that pelvic floor is part of our core. I've already made a video about this, so I'm going to drop the link up here so you can review this. But consider core as a container of our midsection. Think of a canister with a roof or top, that is our diaphragm. Think of a floor, that is the pelvic floor. We called it also pelvic diaphragm. And we've got abdominal wall through the front and through the sides, and also lumbar muscles, lower back muscles, so-called, right? QLs, erector spinae, and even the psoas as the sides, as the walls. And all those muscles work together to create stability to your lumbar spine, which is by design, by evolution, very mobile. It's the most loaded part of the spine, therefore it also results, or it also experiences a lot of probably the most frequent injuries, right? Whether it's disc or degeneration. And also there is a natural curve to that area. And when you consider our chest, lungs and heart, those are supported by the rib cage, by the sternum, the breastbone, and also kind of more rigid thoracic spine. And the same thing when we talk about the pelvic organs, whether it's a bladder or rectum or reproductive organs, they are supported by the pelvic rim, the ilia, the pelvic bones. But the area in between, our gut, part of our liver, intestines, those are pretty much exposed. So the only stabilization that occurs in this region comes from the so-called core musculature. And in a way, it's a weakness because there's no protection to the abdominal organs, and yet it's also an advantage because it allows us to move and twist the way we do. We can flex, we can extend. Let's orient ourselves around the pelvis. Pelvis is composed of two ilia, or ilium on the right, ilium on the left, and these inverted pyramid bone called sacrum, like a centerpiece of the pelvis. And that's the bone really that helps distribute load from the upper body, from the spine onto the pelvis and lower limbs. So very essential area. This is the junction between the upper body and lower body. Pelvic floor is a group of muscles, but also ligaments and fascia that form the base of that container or that canister. And it's really a sling, muscular sling, that is suspended between the pubic bone and the coccyx and also the sit bones. So this is really the base of the pelvic bowl. It's also called a pelvic outlet. And there are certain muscles and ligaments and also fascial connections, fascia that envelops that area and has connection through the lower back to the thoracolumbar fascia, through the front and pubic bone to the abdominal muscles, but also through the groin to the adductus and also abdominals. And more importantly, to the respiratory muscle, the main respiratory muscle called the diaphragm. So you can imagine that through those connections, any disturbance in other areas or pelvic floor will have an impact up or down the chain. And you can imagine this by just imagine how the spider builds a web, and it can, through lines of tension and vibration, can sense that there is a prey, like a fly caught in the net. Okay, so that's how dysfunction of the pelvic floor can occur, especially myofascial pain. And when we think of a pelvic floor, we usually think of the whole group of muscles. We can differentiate the group called levator ani, and as the name suggests, it lifts the anus. So basically, that's the main group. I'm going to show it to you on the body model. And you've got muscles called coccygeus, pubococcygeus, iliococcygeus, and also there are others, like a sling, muscular sling, that actually contributes, let's say, to fecal continence. So when you're in a standing or seated position, it blocks the rectum. But when you're in a squat position, like we say, it's a squatty potty position because this muscle relaxes and allows the passage of feces. Innervation of this area comes from the sacrum, from the sacral space, specifically from the lumbosacral plexus. And we link this to levels S2, 3, and 4, the nerve called pudendal nerve. You know, those problems are related to either too much contraction, chronic contraction, so we call it hypertonia, or not enough contraction, hypotonia. So in the situations where the muscles are too contracted, that can impact your respiration, because when you're inhaling, the diaphragm, respiratory diaphragm that is here and has a dome shape, it contracts and descends, allowing lungs to expand as they fill with air. At the same time, the pelvic floor also descends, not to create resistance to the breathing mechanics. So you can imagine that if pelvic floor cannot relax down, breathing mechanics will be impacted. But also for a lot of females would be just problems with intimacy and pain during intercourse, for instance. When these muscles get loose, you can imagine that not only things can start descending, and that's what we call kind of pelvic prolapse, right? When the vagina and bladder start falling down, which apparently there can be you can sense a bulge in the area and a sense of heaviness. But that's a little bit more extreme, but it does happen. Obviously, when the muscles were overstretched, so let's say post-labor, after you had children, and what happens is that these muscles that are there to contract and control the flow of matter, whether it's urine or feces, those are muscles that create our voluntary sphincters. They contract and hold the contents in the pelvic space, while they can also relax under our voluntary control and void either bladder or rectum. So when there's weakness or there's lack of control, like neurological issues, or maybe simply things are not closing properly, there may be something called urinary incontinence or fecal incontinence, which means leakage of the matter. And that can be problematic, can be, you know, altering quality of life, decreasing quality of life, and that's why we're talking about that specifically. The leakage can happen when there is increased pressure on the pelvic floor. So think of all the activities, specifically jumping, running, and lifting heavier weights, but also basic physiological responses like sneezing and coughing, which increase intra-abdominal pressure and may cause leakage in that way as well. Not fun. And studies have shown, not necessarily causation, but correlation between the pelvic position and pelvic floor dysfunction. And it's been mentioned that when the pelvis is posteriorly tilted, so it's kind of like the tailbone is tucked under and your lordosis is decreased, so you are hypolordotic, your lower back is flatter, it will change the tension in the area, and it will potentially expose pelvic floor to bigger stress and potentially also lead to dysfunction, right? Because the pelvis should be sitting neutral or slightly tilted anteriorly, so the stresses will be distributed evenly and passed on onto the other regions. But when the pelvis is out of alignment and it's a little bit tilted backwards, the pressure will be going a little bit more towards that posterior region of the pelvic floor. So you may already be aware of Kegel exercises, which are basically contractions of the pelvic floor. Contractions where the muscles or the pelvic floor ascends, and then relaxation when it descends. And in fact, when pelvic floor contracts, it moves upwards and forwards, anteriorly towards the pubic bone, and then it descends towards the tailbone. So pelvic floor contains both fast twitch and slow twitch muscle fibers, which means that even though the majority of the muscle fibers are slow twitch, which means that they are built for sustained slow contractions. Think of like endurance muscle, versus fast twitch fibers, which only comprise a minority, maybe 30% of pelvic floor fibers. Those are for more dynamic, powerful contractions, and those are anaerobic fibers that don't require oxygen. So in sneezing or coughing, those would be engaged. So when you're thinking of your training for pelvic floor, you may think of controlled, sustained contractions for 5 to 10 seconds. Relax, contract and pull that pelvic floor upwards, and then relax. So that will be a slow twitch, versus if you do shorter contraction release, that will be fast twitch. First of all, we need to learn how to relax the pelvic floor, and you can explore a few yogic kind of / Pilates positions to relax the pelvic floor, and that would be child's pose with knees open and focusing on expansion of the rib cage, or happy baby pose with knees going towards your armpits, where you can also focus on opening up that base of the pelvis, moving the sit bones away from one another, tailbone away from the pubis. And that would allow, together with diaphragmatic breathing, open and stretch those muscles. Now, when you're in a child's pose, notice that you're focusing on expansion of the rib cage. And when we're inhaling, the ribs move in certain fashion. You can have breastbone moving forwards and up. You can have your ribs expanding sideways and out and up. And also the lower ribs at the back can also open like a caliper motion, like this. So those 3 motions of the rib cage are important to include. One more exercise, guys, and that will be frog position. That also involves very similar motion as in the previous positions, with knees abducted or hips abducted here, and allows you to again let the gravity help you with your diaphragmatic breathing. Now let's take a look at remaining exercises you can do. Pelvic tucks, and that sort of pelvic tuck would involve not overdoing it from the legs or feet or glute max or quads, but rather literally just lifting the tailbone off the ground. So you're changing position of the pelvis and contracting the pelvic floor and the lower tummy muscles. Now you can reinforce that by adding adduction, since I've already mentioned the connection between the pelvic floor and the adductor fascia, gluteal fascia. You can do this on the back. You can do it in quadruped position on all fours, and you can also use the wall and add the adduction that way. But those will be very, very subtle movements. It's not about muscle burn, but rather connection and awareness. So when you think of just key movements that help you engage the pelvic floor, right? Conscious contraction, diaphragmatic breathing, adduction, but also when you think of connection with the gluteus maximus, you would also want to train your glute muscles equally, and kind of the whole pelvic musculature, right? So core, obliques, psoas as well.
I hope this video was comprehensive and all the information that I provided kind of gave you a little bit better idea of why we're doing the pelvic floor exercises, why in Pilates and yoga we talk about the pelvic floor so much, especially as women.